In the previous lesson, I said that the shape of the routes that we define is important. Those routes, those URL patterns that we design are describing the functionality of our application. In this lesson, I want to elaborate on that and talk about what qualities to strive for when we're designing URLs using the techniques that we learned in the previous lesson. Now, first of all, the MVC framework supports, it actually encourages the creation of RESTful URLs. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It's a set of constraints that you apply to the design of web applications that make them more usable, better performing, and more maintainable. Now, REST was created by a doctoral student as a dissertation, so a lot of the information surrounding this topic is really theoretical in nature, and it doesn't always apply directly to creating URLs for websites. A lot of it is going to apply to URIs for web services, web APIs. And you can see that whenever you read the Wikipedia article on REST. So why should you create RESTful URLs? Well, first of all, keep in mind that you don't have to do this. You can do anything you want. However, if you follow the constraints and you apply them to your design, then the main benefits are, first of all, hackable URLs, like we learned about in the previous lesson, that improve the usability of our website. They're also proven to increase your search engine traffic because they can be easily read in the search results. In fact, there was a famous study years ago by Jakob Nielsen, who is a famous usability thought leader, and that kind of proves this idea and talks about URLs as a user interface, as a way of interfacing with a web application. You should take a look at this URL on screen to find this and go through it. Now, from a practical perspective, it consists of a URL that has segments that describe resources that a user will want to interact with. And then it also describes a set of HTTP methods, the get, put, post, and delete. And what should be returned to the requester is some internet media type for data. And now in our case, since we're designing websites, it's going to be HTML. But again, these ideas were originally applied to web APIs, web services. So the kind of data that's being returned back is going to be JSON or XML, so whatever the case might be. So you might have an endpoint to some resource like you see on screen right now, some entity in the system, like cars, so example.com/cars. This URL would represent a collection of cars in the system. Now, if you send a request for this resource using the get HTTP verb, then you would expect to receive back a list of cars, perhaps even including hyperlinks that you could use to take other actions on this collection of this entity, this car entity. Now, if you send a request for that resource using that URL, using the put HTTP verb, then you're indicating that you want to replace that entire collection with another collection of cars that you're sending in the body of that HTTP message. If you send a request for that resource you see on screen using the post HTTP verb, then you're indicating that you want to add new entries to the list of cars. If you send a request for that resource on screen using the delete HTTP verb, then you're indicating that you want to delete that entire collection of cars. So perhaps you want to deal with a specific car in the system, a specific entity in our system. Well, you might access it like this, /car/123, where 123 is some identifier that represents a specific car in the system. You might choose to use a vehicle identification number, a VIN number, a license plate number, or some other identifier. But for our purposes, we're going to keep it simple and utilize some identifier that's specific to our application, like a database ID, something along those lines. So if you send a request for that resource on screen right now using the get HTTP verb, you would expect to receive back the details for a specific car in our system. If you send a request for that resource on screen using the put HTTP verb, you would expect to update details about that specific car in the system with the new information that you're sending in the body of the HTTP message. If you send a request for that resource using the post HTTP verb, then you are indicating that you want to create a new car in the system with that specific ID, 123. And finally, if you send a request for this resource using the delete HTTP verb, then you're indicating that you want to delete that specific car, that specific entity in the system that corresponds to that ID. Hopefully that all makes sense. See how it's a combination of not only the URL, the route, whatever you want to call it, but it also depends on the HTTP verb. So keep this in mind. To be truly RESTful, you would not make changes to entities, or rather you would not change the state of the system through the use of HTTP GET. You should be able to call any resource with a GET and it doesn't make any modifications in the system. Keep this in mind too. RESTful applications deal with domain resources. So in the examples that I gave just a moment ago, it would be a car or a collection of cars. But it could be a book or an employee or some domain class, some entity in the system, rather than dealing with application resources. So you might see a URL like this, example.com/add-new-car-form/step1. Now that might not be a very good RESTful URL, frankly, because it's more about the steps in the process of a larger system rather than about the entities of the system, like a car, a book, an employee, something along those lines. Okay. Now from a practical standpoint, there are a ton of criteria you'll find out on the internet, a ton of recommendations you'll find out on the internet, and it really depends on who you ask. What do I need to do to make my URLs truly RESTful? In fact, entire books have been written on this topic, so I doubt that I can do it justice in just a few minutes here. Some of the advice will be actually at odds with some of the tooling and the conventions in ASP.NET MVC 5, but here I'm just going to go through a list that I've written down of things that you should keep in mind whenever you're designing RESTful URLs. First of all, you should make the URL as short as possible. This makes URLs easy to write down, easy to spell, easy to remember. Secondly, the URL should be readable. You shouldn't use cryptic text like, and even honestly, cars/123 might be a bad example. Perhaps maybe cars/ID-123. At least you would know what that last segment of the URL represents. It represents some sort of identifier, right? So here's one spot where what we do here, or what we're talking about here, might be at odds with what's easy and convenient to do in ASP.NET MVC. By virtue of the fact that we're using the URL cars/lot-ID-123 with an HTTP GET verb, it's implied that we want the details of that particular car. The details segment would be superfluous, that we typically would add because it's the action method in our URLs, right? So you'd have to decide whether you want to be a purist from a RESTful perspective, or if you want to benefit from scaffolding and the defaults in the MVC framework. These use /details/delete/ID, whatever the case might be. The next thing you want to do is to make your URLs predictable and human guessable. Like we talked about, we'll come back to hackable in a moment. The next thing is that you want to make the URLs meaningful. They should be descriptive of the resource. So the URL should hint at the type of resource the user is accessing. So in WordPress, for example, the default is to create a URL that includes the title of the article or the title of the blog post with each word separated by hyphens. So in that case, you're not using some cryptic ID. The URL is meaningful. I would expect to see information about /blog/what I did with my summer separated by hyphens, right? I would expect to see a blog post about what the author did during his summer. Okay, so make the URL meaningful. you should always use nouns, not verbs, inside of your URLs. So again, this goes back to a piece of advice earlier that you should remember that RESTful URLs are not about they're about entities and about domain objects in the system. They're not about processes or application activities. They're not about convenient names for files and things of that nature from a programmer perspective. Okay. Back to the notion of hackability, URLs should be hackable up the tree, meaning that as you remove segments from the URL, you should get the expected functionality, the expected web page back. So if you start off with a URL like the one you see on screen right now, example.com/car/BMW/3series/328i. If I remove the 328i segment, I'd be able to see all the 3 series models. If I remove the 3 series segment, then I should be able to see all the BMWs. And so it's hackable up tree. By removing segments, I should be able to see kind of the get back up from a higher level. Okay. Another recommendation is to make the URL stateless, meaning that a given resource is the same no matter who's looking at it. So if I were to send you a URL, it shouldn't matter that I'm a different user in the system. That URL should represent one thing in the system, and regardless of who goes to that URL, it should represent still the same thing. You may not have permission to view it, but it should still represent the same idea, the same entity, the same domain class in the system. So if you and I were to both add a task to a list of to-dos, we might see something like this, where when I add my task, it would have the task ID of 1, and then you add a task, and you would see that it's a task ID of 2. That's good. Now, I may not be able to see your task, you may not be able to see mine, but the fact that the IDs are different is important. If we both had a task ID of 1 and it really just depended on who we were logged in as, that would be stateful and would not be a good URL design, because we can never share it with somebody else, right? Because it would conflict with their task ID 1. Now, we might be able to both have the same task ID if there was some additional segment with our username in it. So something like this, /user/bob/task/task1 versus /user/richard/task/task1. Okay, and we would expect those to be different, even though the IDs are the same. The URLs are different. So that's what I mean by stateless. The URL is the URL for a resource, no matter who accesses it. Another recommendation is that you typically want to avoid file extensions, which is not really a problem for us when we're using ASP.NET MVC 5, since there are no files to serve up per se, and the routing system kind of takes this for granted. Another suggestion is to use hyphens rather than underscores to separate words within a segment. Another recommendation is to use a plural path for collection. So instead of car, you should use cars. Now, admittedly, this could make the naming of the controller a bit awkward. If you had something specific in mind, you would choose to create a cars controller, not a car controller. All right. And this last one is really a matter of preference, but you'll see it used frequently. Whenever you have a list of domain entities, you should use query strings to filter, to page, or to sort the list. So here's an example of the list of cars, and I'm going to order it by the year. I'm going to filter it by the make, which will be BMWs only, and I want to only show the second page of results. All right. Now, the filtering part is kind of debatable. And the paging part is too, so it's a matter of style. Here we could have the exact same information conveyed in a URL without so many query string parameters. Example.com/car/BMW/page/2 query string order by equals year. Okay. So again, there are some of these things that are a matter of judgment. And finally, the last good piece of advice I was able to find is that good RESTful URLs should never change. You might want to add additional URLs that represent the same thing in the system, but these new and improved URLs should not be the only way to access the system now. The old URL should always work forever. That's ideal. Okay, so let's recap what we talked about in this lesson. I truly gave you a high-level overview of some of the opinionated ways to implement RESTful URLs. Not everyone will agree with these, and there might be additional guidelines if you're creating a RESTful URL for a web API, a web service, as opposed to a web page like we're learning about here in this series. But that deserves a whole other discussion. If you take nothing else away from this lesson, it should be this: you should take care whenever you're thinking about the design of your URLs. All right, even seek some outside help. Show some friends, some developer friends, example URLs, and then ask them what they would expect to see or expect to experience when they access that particular URL with a particular HTTP verb. So doing some testing before you get deep into development can save you a lot of pain later on. And the good news is that just about whatever you come up with, you can accomplish it using convention routing like we learned about in the previous lesson. And when that fails you, you can try attribute routing like we'll learn about in the next lesson. All right, so we'll see you there. Thanks.